Hey there, welcome to the Jarrett Hill Show. I'm Jarrett Hill, and we've been gone for a couple of weeks. We had some travel, some emergencies, some things kind of come up that delayed us, but we're back. We're here. We've still got 2 more episodes left for this season, and I'm really, really into this conversation that we're having this week with Dr. Momin Malik. He is talking to us about AI. We've been debating how to have a conversation on this show around AI because it is something that I think stokes a lot of fear in a lot of folks, but also has stoked a lot of hope and a lot of questions and a lot of interest and a lot of possibilities for folks. And so I've been really unclear about how to have a conversation around this. Producer Danielle found Dr. Momin Malik, who really speaks to AI in a way that I feel like is aligned with this show and the ways that we can address it from the perspectives of race and power and the ways that it is affecting us in real time, but also giving us some perspective on the future that I haven't heard. I will note that there is a bit of AI pessimism in this conversation, and seeing like it might not be the things that that it's been cracked up to be, and why he believes that. Dr. Momin Malik is this week's JQ&A, and I think if you strap in, if you just kind of go with us on this ride, I think you're going to get something that is really interesting and gives you some new questions and maybe some new perspective on how to be thinking about artificial intelligence in 2026. Check out JQ&A, Dr. Momin Malik. I want to jump in to the conversation with you kind of at the end of a talk that I saw you give, where you made some predictions about AI, and I think they can kind of interestingly frame the conversation that we'll have today. One of those predictions was the hype around AI and machine learning will die in 5 to 10 years as it fails to achieve new successes. And I thought, like, okay, I immediately have to ask more questions about that specifically. And so I'm really curious from your perspective, what does that mean? What do you mean when you say that?
Yes. I should note that this is partially a counterweight to all of the predictions that artificial general intelligence will arrive within 10 years. And there are people who have gone back and looked at all these kind of hype men and boosters. Oh, it's coming in 6 months, 10 years ago. Oh, it's coming in 6 months, 5 years ago. So I'd like to think that mine is a little bit more grounded in science, but it's always hard to know the future. Fundamentally, AI isn't what people think it is, want it to be, are promising, which is it's not actual thinking or intelligence or anything like that. I think chatbots and ChatGPT have changed maybe the horizon I would have predicted in 2019. So I was wrong about that. That's given it a new lease on life, but it still isn't the thing that people want it to be. What all of these things are is using statistical correlations in really clever ways that statisticians never thought to do, never tried to do. But it's all ultimately kind of an illusion of statistics. It's a kind of a performance that is really impressive. And just like you might believe an actor is really another person, it can be very convincing. But just as the actor, isn't an actual person themselves, AI is not really learning or cognition or language or intelligence or reasoning or any of these things. And increasingly, as people rely on it to be those things, I think we'll see a big series of failure points where that won't happen. I think maybe contra what I would have predicted in 2019, which I'm pretty sure I could pull up a slideshow where I made a prediction back then that probably was wrong. Now it's been more than 5 years from then. The thing that might actually fail now are the economics of it. And maybe you or maybe your listeners follow Ed Zitron, who is a fantastic tech commentator and maybe the most prominent journalist critic of the AI industry. If the science were there, it would be one thing. But not only is the science not there, not only is it built on all of these horrific labor abuses, environmental degradation, but it just loses billions of dollars a year. All of this, OpenAI, all of the things within Google and Microsoft and all of the Anthropic things, they're all subsidized by venture capital. None of them are profitable. None of them are on the path to profitability. And now you're starting to see some of the lack of profit kicking in. And you see companies, there was one company that reported blowing $500 million in 1 month. And it wasn't a named company. I'm sure we'll find out what it was eventually. Because when they started being charged what this, these coding agents actually cost to run, they were horrified. It was cheaper to just hire human coders, and better too. All of these coding agents, these large language models, make mistakes because all they're doing is regurgitating things that they've seen before, mixed up a little bit, but they're not genuinely reasoning or doing anything that artificial intelligence imagined or promised.
So let's hang out right here. One of the conversations that I've been interested to have with someone whose opinion I feel like I could trust more than just the vibes that you find kind of online from a lot of folks. I've
Mm-hmm.
been seeing in my feed the way my algorithm is shaped. I've been kind of starting to catch where I'm seeing a bit of the AI pessimism that says this ain't all it's cracked up to be. Right? Do
Yes.
not be scared. Do not be shaping your life around that. Like I've been seeing a lot of different things that kind of say that, and I've been like
Yes.
intrigued by that because I'm like, well, the only other thing that I've been hearing is this huge behemoth is on the way, right?
Yes.
And like we need to be prepared for it. And I've heard the resistance to that is it is not inevitable.
Yes.
And I've even heard you say that as
Yes.
well, that it is not inevitable. When I'm becoming a little bit more of an AI pessimist. I don't even know
Yes.
that I'm a pessimist, but
Yeah.
I'm like, oh well, maybe I should not be so concerned about this. How do you respond to that conversation? What's going off in your mind as I'm
So I
saying
think
that?
there's maybe three things I'll talk about. The first is that the current hype and excitement is all around these large language models and these chatbots. That's probably going to collapse. There are much longer, deep seated issues that will persist. And maybe once the current attention is off of what AI is seen as today, there'll be other background issues that we should absolutely worry about. But they have much less to do with AI and are really a continuation of insurance, credit, and actuarial science. And the problems of those were articulated. There were social movements against them as far back as the 1880s. And the connection there is actuarial science was maybe the first major industry or profession to use correlations at a large scale to make decisions without necessarily caring about the causality. Um, and
Let me
yes,
pause you here to make sure
yes,
that for people that don't speak this language like me, like
mhm,
what that means so that we
yes.
can
So,
understand it.
so let me. I'll give an example that the legal scholar Deborah Hellman wrote about in the late '90s. So it came out that in the 1980s, health insurance companies were trying to find women that were kind of the victims of domestic violence in order to drop them from coverage or to charge them more for coverage. And from the perspective of the insurance companies, this was just rational and fair, right? Why should other people have to pay more money for the people who are in this special class? And she writes, this is abhorrent. We're further punishing the victims of oppression and marginalization, and we collectively as a society should reject this and should not do this. But we, in many ways, still do that. There's a chapter from Devin Fergus, who's a historian from 2013, talking about a ghetto tax of car insurance. That because of segregation, redlining, under insurance, or under development of areas where Black people are forced to live, cars suffer more damage. And so, as long as insurance companies are allowed to use something like zip code, it ends up punishing people for something they have no responsibility over. So what I mean by correlations is if you're just looking at what correlates, being poor is going to correlate with a lot of bad outcomes. And as long as there are systems in society that are allowed to make use of that and not think about responsibility, not think about, well, what is the actual mechanism behind that, and can just use it, that's a major driver and solidifier of inequality. And it has been for more than a century. There were some conversations about this around the civil rights movement that kind of were lost, and insurance companies outmaneuvered some of their critics. And there's a great book about this by Kaylee Horan called Insurance Age, that civil rights campaigners said we should nationalize insurance industries because they're not spreading risk out. They're just concentrating it in Black inner cities. So all of this is one big bucket, and AI is a version of that logic. That's still going to be a problem. And we should make sure that once the hype around these agents, these generative AI models dies down, we don't forget about that kind of through line of the ways that correlations can be used to solidify inequality and cause harm. Another part of this is that you can be a pessimist around is I don't think the economics are going to work out. Certainly the science doesn't work out. And because of those things, there'll be some sort of collapse. For anyone who maybe comes to rely on these tools, that can be a danger. You rely on it to make your life easier. Well, would you pay $1,000 for it? Again, this is reporting from Ed Zitron. Versions of the $200 a month subscription can burn up to $1,000 of cost to OpenAI. So what if people were actually charged, $14,000 for this service instead of $200 a month? Would people still pay for it? And I also tell my students, you might come to rely on this thing, but will you be willing to have another source of basically rent? And this is the dream of these companies, right? To get people hooked in so that they can extract rent from everybody, from every industry, every person forever after, for something that's really not inherently profitable, or people aren't willing to pay it right now before they're locked in. So I would caution anyone who comes to rely on it that maybe you will end up giving another chunk of your paycheck to this service. And then the third thing is that it's not probably going to go away completely, but the danger is still going to be not that this thing actually works, that it replaces knowledge work or whatever it is, but that some executive somewhere would rather have a poorly performing machine than pay people to do the job. People who are, potentially non-compliant, who potentially are labor organizers, all of these things. So it's not that it actually works, but it still might be used as a way to leverage power against labor. And again, some of the places I point to, the AI Con by Emily Bender and Alex Hanna, Karen Howe's Empire of AI, Timnit Gebru's Distributed Artificial Intelligence Institute. So this is me following all of these and trying to put them together, but this is amazing people doing this work that I want to point to and give credit to.
We appreciate a great work cited at the end. So thank you for that. I really do appreciate that. When you talk about correlations, it makes me think about in a speech, in a talk that you recently did, you made reference to a piece called "Your Demand for Statistical Evidence
is racist." Yes,
your demand for statistical proof is racist.
Yes,
and it's so interesting because I am a person who is so prone to like referencing data, right, to make a point, as a journalist for all these years. And like, as soon as I heard just that phrase, I was like, yeah, right. Like, and I think as a Black queer person who has been in journalism this long, whenever I see data, I do kind of look at it a little bit sideways, like, how did they do that poll? Or who were they questioning? Or who weren't they questioning? Or what didn't they consider? Right.
Yes.
And so when I hear you raise correlations in the ways that they can be problematic, it makes me think of that. And it also, you spoke about how lived experience doesn't really get considered in some of those, in the ways that data gets addressed. Can you talk about the importance of lived experience in our conversations around the ways that we consider these things?
Yes. So I'll bring in a few things here. The blog post by Candice Lanius, it's more than a decade old now, and I think it has that amazing rhetorical impact. So I still use it today. And the point the blog post makes is really demands for proof are asymmetric. That if a white woman wanders through a neighborhood and thinks it's sketchy, that's accepted. But as soon as you say, there's police brutality, then you need evidence, you need proof. And there's always this presumption that marginalized people are faking it, are delusional, are wrong. And these demands for proof are also never enough. And there's a beautiful quote by Toni Morrison from a graduation speech she gave in, I think, 1970, that the function of racism is a distraction. People said, Black people's heads were shaped the wrong way, that they had no language, they had no history or kingdoms, and all of these, Black scholars dug it up, but it'll always be something else. It'll never be enough. The point is not that data is some objective field that will finally resolve these issues. It's just put in more hoops. And I think we see at the highest levels of policymaking, data and evidence don't matter. It's driven by ideology. And that isn't inherently a bad thing. I think if we had ideologies like ethics of care, where we focus on the needs of the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, that would be a great way to maybe run a society. But again, it's ultimately at the very top, not people who are swayed by data, convinced by data. And so chasing quantitative proof is always going to be a distraction and sapping people's efforts. And I want to give the other side of this is that there's needs to be a role for that. And I was watching your interview with Dr. Dorothy Brown, ways in which oppression acts that we wouldn't even think of that can be investigated, but I don't think we should privilege quantification necessarily. Sometimes that's going to be the right way to look at systems that are quantitative and how they work, but it should be grounded in people's lived experience. And that's always a hard thing when from a young age it's drummed into us that the numbers are what's real, the numbers are what matter. But it's all kind of this big shell game. And I recommend Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein's Data Feminism, and also Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology for kind of good primers on this issue.
I appreciate that. Not part of the conversation I was planning on having with you. You made reference to Dr. Dorothy Brown, and I was already saying to myself, like, I want to reference back this correlation piece to the way that Dr. Dorothy Brown talked about taxes.
Yes.
So I kind of love that you made that already. And the thing I wasn't planning on talking about in this interview was the ways in which I have been finding myself not trusting the institutions that I've grown to trust, respect, rely on for so many years after divinity school. I'm not Christian anymore. I feel a lot of different ways about being a part of the media over the years. And now I even feel this way about being American. And so I find myself being very distrustful of all of these systems in so many different ways. And Dr. Dorothy Brown's conversation around taxes was another one of those moments where it was highlighted for me that, like, while many Americans right now are very concerned about the democracy and the ways in which we are kind of changing or shifting or seeing things more acutely than we have in the past, I think that last piece is what's really been working on me, is that, like, I don't even know how much different things are so much as they are a lot more overt, right? I think we kind of have this conversation around, like, oligarchy in this country now that we've been having in the last couple of years that we haven't had the same way pre this, return of Trump. And it makes me think about the ways in which we've always been run by the most powerful, most rich, most privileged folks, but, like, it's a lot more in our faces now. And I think AI is one of those places that we're kind of seeing, like, this same kind of conversation of, like, money and privilege really being in a hierarchical place above humanity, above the environment, above everyday people. And so the challenge that I'm having is being so frustrated with all of these institutions that I feel like I can't trust, and being told that there are things that are inevitable, that this AI situation it's coming, and you're gonna have to deal with it.
Yeah.
And I know for me, I've been saying to my team, like, I don't want to not use it and be the old man shaking, a stick at change, but I
Yeah.
also don't want to be the person who's like contributing to it as well. So there's so many pieces of it.
I think there is an important place for, well, a bunch of things you mentioned that I'll try to pick up. Starting with the last thing first, there has to be a place for refusal. So I think there are lots of ways that I could engage with generative AI, particularly in the courses I teach, to meet students where they're at. Um, but I like to, I know how to code. I know how to write really well, technical language, precise language. So I'm a native English speaker. So in many ways, I'm fortunate to not be in the vulnerable position that many people are in when they turn to AI. Um, but I still, try to make refusal a legitimate stance. Um, Cory Doctorow, who has this recent book, Enshittification, who's been talking about this for a long time, he, I think, quotes things from Margaret Thatcher's time, that when she said there is no alternative, what people really meant was stop trying to think of an alternative. And I think, again,
Mm.
referring back to Ruha Benjamin, who's also written about kind of the writer of refusal, and that as a important stance to take and do. She's also written about imagination recently, about the important role of imagining other ways of being and working. And this is not new. I mean, Robin D.G. Kelly has this book, Freedom Dreams, that's all about imaginations of freedom and reparations, and how we can turn to some of those for alternatives of what the future can and ought to look like. So I would say there's an important individual role of refusal. Be careful of the bait and switch. The same companies that were pushing their employees to use as much AI as possible are now probably going to turn around and punish employees for using too much AI, because it turns out to be so expensive once it's no longer being subsidized by venture capital to lock people in and make them dependent, right? So beware the possible bait and switch. If you do become, the person who's using it, well, maybe you'll become the person who has to pay a good chunk of your money for it. Oh man, a whole bunch of things. Going back through the through lines, I think institutions have always been mixed. And I think even looking at science as an institution, part of my work is in the field of science and technology studies, where there was a big critique from scientists in the 90s in particular, saying to this group of sociologists and anthropologists, you're undermining science. You are empowering the climate change deniers, the creationists. And there are cases where maybe that's true. But the response to that was, well, by depicting science as this infallible enterprise, when science changes and evolves as it does and finds new things, then what does that do for people's perception of its credibility and their trust in it? So being open about the limitations and failures of institutions is a good way to know the extent to which to trust them. And I think I did some work after my undergrad on media as well. And this was back in 2009, 2010. There was a lot of hand-wringing over, internet information seeking and Wikipedia. And part of the lesson that I drew there was there's always been a mainstream media element that has been hostile to the perspectives of marginalized people. And, there's the Overton window, and there's all these things about agenda setting and framing. That was always a problem. And just because institutions maybe kept out certain forms of the worst and most harmful misinformation doesn't mean they were perfect. And conversely, misinformation and disinformation are still things that are worth thinking about and naming. Maybe not even in those terms. I think those terms sometimes assume that there is a truth, not recognizing that truth is always up in the air, and it always seems to benefit people in power, the way truth comes down. But that's the complicated thing about institutions. And I'm not somebody who's been one of the most harmed by institutions, so I'm kind of it's much easier for me to be a part of these. But that's always been a problem, a longer standing problem.
Quickly, you made reference to the Overton window, and I feel like
Yes.
we hear people referring to it in pop culture more. Can you unpack what that is for folks if they don't understand?
Oh goodness. I'm not a media scholar or media studies person, so I'm only going to know the pop version of this. But it's my understanding is that it's the window of what types of things are considered legitimate.
Mm,
So for a long period of time in the early 20th century, blatant racism was acceptable. And even through maybe Strom Thurmond, you look at the statements he made throughout his career, and he was still a respected elder statesman serving in the Senate until his death. After a certain point, it shifted, and so you weren't allowed to make these overtly racist statements, and that's maybe changed now. So the Overton window is the window of what is deemed to be acceptable discourse and speech in a public sphere. That window has a political function to keep out Nazis, extremists, but also to keep out the legitimate justice demands of marginalized groups. And shifting the Overton window is when you manage to successfully make things a part of acceptable public discourse, whether it's, shithole countries or whether it's single payer universal public health care. There's always demands about what perspectives are seen as legitimate for inviting to the 24-hour news cycle roundtable when you want to represent quote unquote both sides. So you're probably going to do a much better job than I would, but that's my
I
understanding of it and how I'm using it.
well, candidly, my producer Danielle just said this is a perfect explanation. Like this was really great. So like I think about this in terms of media quite a bit from working at media so long. I think about it when I'm watching old television. Right, I'm a big fan of Living Single. There's an Overton joke sitting here somewhere, but I think
Yeah.
about the jokes that were okay for them to make back then, um, or the things that they couldn't say back on television back in the 90s, right? That nowadays feel so generic or so light or so accepted or so common.
Yeah.
And I'm intrigued by that because it's always something that I'm kind of watching how those things evolved. And I feel like since June of 2015, when Donald Trump came down
Golden
that
escalator.
escalator,
Yeah.
yeah, we've been seeing this a lot more clearly and overtly because of the way that it's been depicted in media, right? The way
Yes.
that the news cycle, as you speak of, has been impacted, the way that we have shifted what we are used to hearing people say on TV, the way that we've shifted our expectations. I think even right now, to your point, seeing the Obamas on this tour as they are opening the presidential center, it is a reminder of what it sounds like to have a different president, right? And whether you think it's better or worse, and obviously I think it was better, it
Mhm.
does show us like what is acceptable to us as president, what is ideal, what is aspirational, and then
Mhm.
you flip and you see what we have today, and it's like we've gotten used to a whole lot more, a whole lot more of a challenging way to think about the ways that we hear and see these different things. I'm curious about this from the perspective of the hopeful side. Like what
Yes.
is encouraging you? What are you seeing that's giving you some hope?
Um, I think the market kind of impending market collapse of generative AI hype. It's going to be disastrous for all of the investment that's taken place in it. I think if you take out the part of the economy that's grown due to this bubble of generative AI, the economy has barely grown at all. And so, pensions, 401ks, all of these things get invested in these companies, the ones who are listed. And that's probably going to be a lot of pain and misery that the people who caused all of this probably will never be held to account for. But at the same time, that will put a stop to this really scientifically vacuous pursuit, this environmentally disastrous pursuit, this labor exploitation, environmental degradation, all of that. So I'm hopeful that the market correction will actually do what maybe social movements have been hollowed out and are struggling to be able to accomplish. And in particular, movements against data centers, I think are one really positive place to look for as hopeful points. But it might end up being the economics of it end up destroying or self-destructing. But I'm also hopeful that people who want to regulate AI, not the generative AI kind, but the kind that makes automated decisions based on what data are optimal, it might cause people to stop and look back at insurance and credit and the ways that those are also built on correlations and drive inequality, and maybe reopen some of the debates that were prematurely closed in the 70s against maybe the people who are fighting for different visions of the future. And there's a article from my colleague Rodrigo Ochagame, The Long History of Algorithmic Fairness, that kind of traces a very strong through line from actuarial fairness, which is actually deeply unfair. It just says if it correlates, it's fair to use. So you can use zip code even though it ends up being racially discriminatory. You can use whatever except for a few explicitly prohibited things. But there's so many things that are linked to those. Maybe some of these debates will reopen, and maybe we can start working towards, and again, referencing legal theory, there's this distinction between anti-classification and anti-subordination. Again, not a legal theorist. I only know what I've read of this. I haven't really deeply studied it. Anti-classification is this idea that just ignore categories and everything will be fine. And this is some of the critiques of Justice Roberts. The way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. Well, it's not that simple. Versus anti-subordination, which was a through line in U.S. employment law, but it's clearly been disfavored, which is that if you start off at unequal baselines, ignoring people's classification isn't actually going to make things fair or equal. And of course, we have a Supreme Court legal regime that's actively hostile to this perspective, but maybe there will be openings where we can go back and say, actually, people should not be punished for their oppression, for their circumstances, for the historical processes that they have no control over and would wish to be different. Maybe we can build in reparative actions to this. I still think it's a long shot, but that's one hope I have, that if we regulate AI in a good way, it might inadvertently regulate some of the larger issues that have gone unnoticed and foreclosed on.
I want to double click. You said there were like 8 different things I wanted to follow up on, but we don't have time for that. But one of the things that I want to follow up on that you've mentioned a couple of times is the idea of revisiting credit and credit and what was the other?
Insurance.
They were like insurance.
Yeah. Yes.
I would love if, kind of in the spirit of Dr. Dorothy Brown's interview, she was talking about taxes and how specifically with Black women in marriage, the way that even like the very specifics of that, like really disadvantage most Black women. Yes. I'm curious if there's an example within insurance or credit that you could give us that shows us. You talked about earlier the way that zip codes work for insurance and like different examples of those things. Can you expound on another example like that?
Yes. So the best example, and also it's been studied a lot, there was a recent, maybe like 5 years ago, ProPublica piece on kind of drivers who were equivalent, except for their zip code and race, had very different car insurance rates. I'm going to try to think of another good example of this.
I mean, when you say
Yeah.
credit, I immediately think about the ways in which credit is something that is one already like just a scam in general. Like when you
Yes.
think about how
Yes.
credit is something that it doesn't, it I could go on and on about credit over with my experience of credit, like the ways in
Mhm.
which it doesn't include your rent or your phone bill. It only includes certain kinds of things that people pay,
Yes.
and like how that skews in a very racist, anti-poor kind of way.
Mm.
But sorry, go ahead.
No, absolutely. I'm not thinking of an example other than car insurance that I can give more specifics about. But in the area where I work for health insurance, there's a famous example, and I'll bring it up because it's widely talked about. There was a paper by Ziad Obermeyer and colleagues about an unnamed healthcare system, which people later pieced together was Optima, which is under what is it, United Healthcare, I think. They were using a model to decide which patients to give extra support to for certain conditions. And they built this model based on anticipated healthcare costs, which had the nice from their perspective feature of being a single metric you could use across a bunch of different conditions. So you didn't have to track blood pressure and whatever else it was. And so in this paper, they got access to this model and they found that equivalently sick Black and white patients were treated very differently. White patients would be defaulted into these assistance programs, where Black patients were not even recommended for them. And it's because for the same amount of healthcare spending, Black patients were much sicker in terms of the actual indicators for a number of different diseases. So that's a system that was in place, was affecting millions of people, and that's maybe another example. Although again, it's hard to know how isolated that may or may not be in the larger scheme. Car insurance, this is something. I mean, even the future Justice Thurgood Marshall, when he lived in Harlem in the, I want to say 1930s, he was denied auto insurance because of quote unquote traffic congestion. And maybe it was just racism then, or maybe Harlem really was more congested because there was a lack of investment. And so, whether or not there was an intention by individual insurance agents to discriminate, and there may well have been, they had this cover of, it's just data, it's just objective, and not looking at the deeper causal relationships that were behind that.
Yeah, as you say that, I think about we often hear about the ways in which Black patients, Black Americans, experience adverse health outcomes, have higher rates of this, that, and the other. Survival rate is lower, mortality rate for Black women, like the various different ways in which the medical system or the our experience of health in America as Black folks is distinctly different,
Yes.
and usually more pronounced and acute. And I think about the various different things that inform that. Um,
Mhm.
we've obviously already talked about taxes on the show. We've talked a good amount about food and the ways in which food is available to certain folks in certain areas and not available to others. The way that we have food deserts, the way that we have organic foods that are available to some folks and some foods that have all kinds of other chemicals in them. But the ways in which our doctors consider us when we're in health practice and like don't want to give us tests or don't want to like listen to the experience that we're having, and all of these different factors that kind of go into the indicator that you're talking about, right? That is not just like, oh, this person cost us more, this person is sicker. It's like
Yes.
there are various contributing factors to the ways in which these things come in,
Mhm.
which again makes me talk about the ways in which I have a hard time trusting the institutions when you can see the myriad ways that they have data that they know these impacts are happening,
Mhm.
and they continue to do them. So, um, Dr. Malik, before we let you go, I just want to say I'm really, really grateful for your time here today and kind of unpacking some of these things. Last thing that I've heard you mention in a couple of times, and I was like, oh, it'd be great for him to break this down. Can you talk
Mhm.
a little bit about the difference between generative AI and the other types of AI that we see
Yes.
as LLM or those things?
Yes. Um, the underlying approach behind generative AI or generative, LLMs and other forms of AI is the same, which is using kind of correlations to do things. How we interact with it ends up being very different. So the way that large language models work is they get tons and tons of text. And there's work about the open crawl data set and all the toxic language that, most of these companies ended up relying on some version of. You see, the word happy is followed by birthday in this tiny fraction percentage of cases. And then to you follows that also a certain fraction of the time. And if you observe enough of these word co-occurrence frequencies and kind of ordering of words, you build a model that can spit out a likely next word. And these already existed, and versions of them go back to Markov models and even like the 70s and 80s. But they only got really large enough to do impressive things in maybe the 2010s. And then OpenAI's maybe big innovation was to make this into a chatbot. And so the correlations are used to create this kind of illusion of language, or of a person who is talking to you, or of knowledge work or information retrieval. So that's one set of things that's specifically using language and images and audio and all of these things to generate realistic sounding, text or images or video or whatever else it might be. But those correlations can also be used for simpler forms of data. Like, let's take every single fact we know about a person and whether people like this person repaid a loan or not, and then use that correlation to make future decisions about whether we should grant loans to this type of person or not. So the same principle about, well, we're not going to care about how language works. We're not going to care about how the human visual kind of system sees a particular animal in a pattern of pixels. We're just going to try to mimic it. We're going to try to build an input-output kind of mapping, which again, statistics really didn't think about doing. Computer science ended up taking some of these statistical tools and building systems out of them to do some of these things. So the underlying mechanism is the same, but we interact with large language models in a different way because there's these extra layers that have been put on top to create this illusion of, again, like you're talking to somebody, or that there's a mind you're conversing with. So that's in practice the difference. And of course, you can use that to write emails, to summarize things, although the summary might be wrong because it's always just based on words that it's seen together in large bodies of text before. And that may or may not coincide with truth or accuracy or things that we may want to interpret into it. So that's the similarities, same underlying technology and concepts, but it's packaged in a particular way around language and images in particular that make our interactions with it something different than like an insurance score might be, which is not text that we can read and interact with. That is just a number between 0 and 1 about, what's the chance that somebody will default on a loan or something like that.
It's so interesting when you put it this way. It makes me think about the different posts that I've seen where it's like on your autocorrect, if you just type the middle word and just make a sentence out of it long enough, like post what that sentence looks like. And that this is kind of a version of that just spits out what it thinks the next word is going to be. And it also makes, go ahead.
And I was going to say, so those are some of the older versions of these large language models. Large language models, they do some fancier technical things that kind of put words into a what's called in statistics a latent space, where you represent things as numbers, whereas some of the autocorrect things, you could still crack open the model and see, oh, this word follows this word. So it was more less opaque. And now these models are so big that even if you did crack them open, you don't have individuals' words stored anymore. It's just all numbers at a certain point before they come back out as words. But yes, conceptually, autocorrect is the same sort of thing. And so when you see people making fun of ChatGPT as fancy autocorrect, there's a lot of truth to that, even if the math is fancier by a large degree. Conceptually, it's still the same sort of thing.
That's so interesting. Okay. Um, Dr. Malik, tell people where they can connect with the work that you're doing. I'm sure people will have
Oh
questions
goodness.
about like how, and I know there's many places.
Yeah. So I am not super active in public areas. My name, mominmalik.com, is where I have a lot of my work. Um, I am part of the Institute in Critical Quantitative, Computational, and Mixed Methodologies at Johns Hopkins, and that's a great place to look. It's a training institute, so it's not like we have a ton of resources, but people affiliated with that institute are great people to look at for critiquing some of these things. I'm on Mastodon. I hardly ever post there, but yeah, I'll eventually maybe try to have more of a presence somewhere where people can see me and reach me. But for
Let me
now,
tell you,
yeah,
all of us think you're very cool for not being too on the internet. I'm
thanks.
increasingly wanting to be less on the internet as I'm
Yeah,
here on the internet having this conversation. So but I get it. I get it. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for being here today.
my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Quickly, I told y'all, like, he's got some interesting perspective in there. I wanted to go off on another bit about the ways in which AI is like just stealing from us, right? We talked about that autocorrect piece there at the end where it is kind of taking our language and reading it and seeing what we do normally and building something out of that. But it is also doing that with our art, with our literature, with our video, with our film, with our television. And as an artist, I think about this as someone who has hours and hours, hundreds of hours of podcasts and video and television of myself out in the world, but also as a person who is a painter and who is creating new art, being concerned about the ways in which those things get compromised by AI. So I'm thinking about it in that way. I'm thinking about what happens with all of these things that we've put out into the world, and how we can see these big companies taking those things and grinding them down into little bits of data that it pops out that comes from a post, or excuse me, comes from a prompt that we put into an AI generator, and really, see what it regurgitates back to us. Sometimes really interesting things, sometimes really innovative ideas, sometimes things that are completely incorrect. And so I was thinking about that, talking with Dr. Malik. There was so many different things that I wanted to chat about, but we only had 45 minutes, and so we had to get out of there. I hope you got something out of it. I'd love to hear in the comments what things really resonated with you, what kind of questions you have now. This is something that we will definitely be talking about next season as well. So whatever your questions are, let us know. You can put them into the comments. You can DM them to us, whatever is necessary to communicate with us. So I appreciate you watching with us today. We are going to be back next week. As a bit of a preview, we're talking about wanting to leave. That's kind of the way that we've been dubbing it in our conversations with the team, of like wanting to leave the country and figuring out, like, is that possible? Is that a real option? What are the ways that we can be thinking about that? And we've got some interviews with some folks who are asking that question and have maybe even answered it for themselves. And you can look forward to that on next week's finale of this first season of the Jarrett Hill Show. So I'm excited. We've already started doing those interviews, and it's going to be really, really interesting. And you might get some insight into what I'm looking at for my own future. So we will see you here next week. Have a great one, and take care of yourself. Hey, what's up? I'm Jarrett, and you just finished watching a clip from The Jarrett Hill Show. The Jarrett Hill Show, me being Jarrett Hill. And I would love it if you would like, subscribe, share with your friends, talk to someone about what you saw, and we'll see you next time.